Um, and then obviously from these assessments, we have to create goals. When you read goals for autistic clients, what tells you whether a therapist truly understands the autistic individual?
As an individual. That's the key word. In your assessment, you need to be addressing this as an individual, not just an autistic person, not their label. Focus on them as an individual, and what you see as positive that you're going to be able to build on, what you see as barriers that you're going to have to help them get around or work on, and especially those where they're on the verge. And no one ever mentions the facts that what areas are they close to normal, close to that thing. They're on the verge of learning. Those should become your goals, not the lowest things that they can't do. Obviously, they're not anywhere close to being ready to learn those. And yet, if you tackle those, you're going to have those same goals over and over and over. And then you're going to feel like a failure. You're going to feel like you failed them. And because they're going to feel like, well, geez, I can't seem to learn this. Well, they weren't ready.
Hi, I'm Staci Neustadt. I am a speech language pathologist and the CEO at Making Sense of Autism, and I'm a student of Susan.
And I'm Susan Golubock. I am a now retired occupational therapist who has worked many, many years after I discovered even my own autism.
Thank you for joining us at Making Sense of Autism. If you're supporting autistic individuals and you feel like there's a better way than focusing on behaviors alone, you're in the right place. Each week, we share practical strategies and insights from the autistic perspective. Subscribe and visit makingsenseofautism.com for free tools and resources. I'm a speech language pathologist, and I know sometimes after an evaluation, I used to think, I know what my client struggles with, but I don't understand why. Have you ever had that feeling after you do an evaluation, which is supposed to guide our goals and guide our treatment plan? As therapists, we're expected to write goals, make recommendations, solve behavior concerns, and help teams support students and clients. But many of the assessments leave us with more questions than answers. Why can they do it one day and not the next? Why do behaviors show up in some situations and not others? If you've ever felt stuck, you're definitely not alone. So, Sue, as an autistic occupational therapist, what do you feel like is the biggest thing therapists miss when they assess autistic individuals?
One of the first things that I did when I knew I was going to work with a new client is I would look at what do I know about them? And of course, I would start with their diagnoses, and what do I know or understand about it? I would have to research it, especially when I first had my first autistic clients. Like, what do I know about it? That's how I self-discovered. The more I read about autism, the more I realized, oh my gosh, they're telling my story. So to understand that individual, now, granted, that only told me about maybe how some co-occurring conditions or the medication they were on, or it told me about them, information I needed to start, but it still didn't tell me about who they were as a person. And this is why I always started with a child-led approach, or in this case, maybe an adult-led approach, whatever the client was. I introduced them to what I had to offer, found out what they are interested in. What what would you like to start with? Because that way I needed to discover who they were as a person, what motivated them, um, what needs they were expressing they had by what they sought out. Um, those things were then I had a better direction because I had a saying that I found when I first started as a therapist. Any road will get you there if you don't know where you're going. And so I needed to find the right road to feel successful with that individual.
And as occupational therapists, you guys do have a very neuro-affirming tool, the sensory profile, or at least I feel like it's neuro-affirming because it gives you an idea of what the individual seeks or avoids. And so I feel like that tool does give you a really good glimpse of what the individual may need.
Mhm.
I don't know about some of the other assessments, like the visual processing, things like that. But in terms of speech therapists, where we're just looking at vocabulary and expressive language and receptive language, or even especially the social communication assessments, which we know are absolutely not neuroaffirming because they look at eye contact and on-topic conversation. I would say pretty much all of our tools are not neuroaffirming because they look at the neurotypical development and they look at, especially when it comes to language, are they using single words, two words? Well, if they're a gestalt language processor, they're going to be using large chunks of language. So this may impact speech therapists more than OTs. What do you think?
Oh, I totally agree. And that's why one of the first things I gravitated into as a therapist, because I knew I had sensory processing issues and I needed to better understand myself. Um, and so is most assessments look at function. Can they or can they not? And if they can't, well, then, of course, that's what we need to work on. But the sensory integration looks at how the brain processes information. Now, that was the first, because neurology has always been my passion, wanting to understand why my brain doesn't seem to work like everybody else's brain did. Um, and just even trying to understand their brain. I focused on psychology, neurology, um, uh, even the gut, because that was an issue for me too, as to how those chemicals feed the brain that it needs to function. So my passion has always been understanding the brain. And that's why we call this um, the neurostrength, i.e., looking at the strength of the way the brain works, not just their personality strengths, their functional strengths. But that gives us the answer to why they respond the way they do. And that's what we need to be looking at, especially with the autistic, because we can function like everyone else at times, but not consistently. So, what is wrong with there? Well, that's what research is finding, is that the autistic brain is inconsistent in its ability to make connections. And a lot of it comes down to the gut. It's not feeding the right chemicals to the brain to make it function at any given time. We've got to understand the neurology of the individual that we're dealing with before we can really understand how to help them and why they're struggling and how we can help them.
And it doesn't matter if you're an OT, PT, SLP, you have to at least understand a little bit of that. And I feel like that's, especially as SLPs, that's where we get stuck. And recently, I was part of a post where we talked about social communication versus pragmatic language. You can't really separate the two. The pragmatic language is that language piece, that
Mhm.
hard skill, and the social communication is that soft skill. And you can't separate them because they impact each other. And I feel like that applies even to language skills.
Mhm.
Because I definitely have kids where if you give them a word bank, they can come up with beautiful sentences. But if they have to think of all the words on their own and then
Mhm.
organize, and but we don't necessarily learn about that, about the tools that are going to help somebody process language, or the supports that are going to help someone process language in an easier way, which That's really, we want to teach them these strategies to make it easier. Because I know sometimes when I get a new student through the school I contract with, they'll say, no, I don't want speech therapy anymore because these are older students. And then when I explain to them how I take a different approach to supporting them, oftentimes they change their mind. They're like, oh, okay, that sounds good. Because they're so used to just that drill and kill of
Mhm.
working on vocabulary. And it was hard for them to word find and things like that. And so it was difficult and so stressful. And so we talk about, no, we're going to learn strategies to make your life easier so you can graduate because it's a graduate recovery program. And I think this applies to all neurodivergent individuals. But again, these are things that assessments do not tell us. Um, and so what's one thing that you feel like therapists could do even if they have to give a standardized test, because say insurance requires
Mhm.
it. And, we have our own assessments, which people absolutely can use and look at the holistic, the whole child. But if they have to do a standardized assessment, what is one thing that they could do when they have those scores? How can they look through it through a neuro-affirming lens?
Start by using the information, not the statistical results that say, yes, they're behind. Okay, that was obvious before you started. But let's look at some of the individual subsections, and even within those subsections, what are their strengths? What do they do well? Instead of looking at what they can't do, and the goal is look at what they can do. Look at what they're on the borderline of being able to do. They're ready to do so that you can build on. Don't start with the lowest thing that they can't do. Come on, give me a break. Start with what they're on the verge of learning. That's what we call a potential strength. You can build it into a strength, build up their strengths. Then look at under the circumstances of the testing, what do they struggle with the most? What were the barriers to them giving the responses you want? I know on standardized tests you can't give them prompts, but look at the times that you felt you had to give them a prompt. They could do it if you would just give them that prompt, but you couldn't do it. That's the barrier that's getting in their way. That's how you're going to learn. What about what upset them during the testing? What was too hard? They just weren't ready for it. Those are triggers. Or an unready state where they have no interest, no ability to respond. Look at the information that you can get from it, regardless of the standard. Now, you need the standardized tools to convince insurance that this individual needs therapy. No problem. But you've got a lot of data that you can look at with your standardized tests
And you
from
can
the framework that we propose.
And you can use the language. You can still use
Mhm.
neuroaffirming language, even when you're writing these assessments, and use terms like barriers and triggers, because the barrier is obviously the reason they need therapy, the reason they need support. And so even just shifting that language is still going to qualify them for those services. But think about the person that's reading the the report. You can't unsee those things. And so if they're starting to read reports that are neuroaffirming, they're going to have a different lens of autism, a different, instead of talking about their behaviors and their refusals and their perseverations, what if you're talking about, their potential strengths that are emerging, the barriers that get in the way of them accessing these skills? It's even going to shift their perspective of autism. And that's a great way to continue to shift forward. Um, and then obviously from these assessments, we have to create goals. When you read goals for autistic clients, what tells you whether a therapist truly understands the autistic individual?
As an individual, that's the key word. In your assessment, you need to be addressing this as an individual, not just an autistic person, not their label. Focus on them as an individual, and what you see as positive that you're going to be able to build on, what you see as barriers that you're going to help them get around or work on, and especially those where they're on the verge. And no one ever mentions the facts that what areas are they close to normal, close to that thing. They're on the verge of learning. Those should become your goals, not the lowest things that they can't do. Obviously, they're not anywhere close to being ready to learn those. And yet, if you tackle those, you're going to have those same goals over and over and over. And then you're going to feel like a failure. You're going to feel like you failed them. And because they're going to feel like, well, geez, I can't seem to learn this. Well, they weren't ready.
In thinking about the goals that you used to give when you were an OT, what were some, what, how did you focus? Well, when you were working on neuro-affirming goals as an occupational therapist, how did you frame your goals?
And again, you have to remember, I was in the process of learning as well.
Yeah.
Here's how I was taught you're supposed to write these goals. But that didn't always have, so my written reports probably weren't any different, but how I approached them as far as treatment was concerned, that's what mattered. That's how I approached targeting those goals. And yes, one of the things I depended on the most was, of course, the sensory processing, because that is a big issue for most autistics. How do I get their attention if it doesn't appeal to what input matters to them? How can I communicate with them if, I mean, I can see right away bombarding them with words, they just totally tune me out. So, no, I'm not going to use that. So it was more instinctive on my part. But then, of course, I was coming from my perspective that made a lot of sense to me. And I could understand from my own needs why they had these needs. So, yes, the sensory aspect was I've got to start with how I can reach them. And how do you get through to someone except through their senses?
In order to create a neuro-affirming assessment, we really have to understand how the neurology works, as well as providing the environment that is safe and allowing them to be their authentic selves, seeing the barriers that are getting in the way, and not just focusing on those deficits, which is huge. And it is doable. Even with insurance, it is doable. A lot depends on the language that we use. So, um, great insight, Sue. We definitely can make this shift, and be sure to follow us because we do have an assessment that will be launching again later this summer. And our new assessment that we're going to be putting out very soon is our neuro-affirming social communication profile, where not only do you look at the barriers that are getting in the way, those soft skills, you actually find out from the individual what skills around social communication that they want to learn and what do they not want to be expected of them. So great information on assessments. Be sure to follow us and hit subscribe. Thanks for the information, Sue.
Thanks for asking, Staci.